All right, welcome everyone to the 21st Century Man podcast. Today we are going on a deep dive, a pretty fascinating one actually, into the very first chapter of this book, The Hero's Journey. Appropriately titled, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think it's a great title for kicking things off. And Dr. Judson Brandeis, the author of this chapter, who's actually a urologist who made a pretty interesting career shift himself, really sets the stage here. He dives into the big question of what it really means to live life as a man. What does that journey actually look like?
Yeah, and I think he does such a good job in this chapter pulling from, the work of Joseph Campbell, who's kind of I guess you could say the expert on mythology and the hero's journey across cultures. And this chapter looks at those timeless patterns of how we transform as individuals, how we move from, being kind of inexperienced and young to hopefully becoming more mature and wiser.
It's a great framework for understanding how men grow and evolve. And one thing that really resonated with me right off the bat was how the chapter emphasizes this idea that everyone listening, every single guy out there has these unique gifts inside of them. We're all on our own paths, facing our own challenges and finding our own opportunities.
Yeah, it's kind of inspiring to think about, and I like how the chapter highlights those real life examples of people like Charles Darwin, right? I mean, his biggest breakthroughs and his most impactful work that didn't happen until later in his life. And you have Sam Walton, who started Walmart when he was already in his 40s, or Bill Wilson, one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, who also kind of discovered his real purpose later on. It makes you realize that it's never too late to start.
Absolutely. It really reinforces this idea that your journey can begin or be completely redefined at any point. You don't have to follow a set timeline. And the chapter does a great job of weaving in these inspirational figures. Like right from the start, it kicks off with this quote from Joseph Campbell who says, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." I mean, that's powerful stuff. It immediately sets the tone for this whole exploration of personal transformation.
It really does. Okay, so let's dive into the first stage that Dr. Brandeis lays out, which is the departure. Now, this is all about describing that familiar world of our childhood. All those cultural influences, traditions, those basic understandings of how things work. It's like our initial unchallenged reality, the world we're born into.
Yeah, and I think the chapter does a good job of pointing out how comfortable that familiarity feels, right? It's easy to kind of take that world for granted, just accepting those established norms and expectations that are all around us as we're growing up.
But here's where it gets interesting, right? The big takeaway here is that if we really want to step into manhood and carve out our own unique identity, we have to be willing to leave that comfort zone behind. We have to start questioning those external rules and even those limitations we've placed on ourselves.
It's a critical realization, that sticking to what's comfortable could mean missing out on so much more. And the book actually encourages you, the listener, to think about your own origins, right? Where did you come from? How far have you actually traveled from that starting point? And maybe even think about those around you who haven't ventured too far from their comfort zones. What might they be missing out on? The thought-provoking question, right?
It really is. I mean, the chapter kind of suggests that while being a big fish in a small pond might feel good in the moment, you could actually be preventing yourself from realizing your full potential on a much larger stage. It makes you wonder about those trade-offs we sometimes make.
It does, and from that point of departure, we move into this really crucial stage called the call to action. Now, this is the moment when you're summoned to begin your journey, right? It's not always a literal phone call, but it could be some internal nudge, some external event that kind of shakes you up and disrupts that status quo, that comfortable existence you were talking about.
And I think the chapter does a good job of highlighting that a lot of men actually resist that call for a variety of reasons, right? Maybe it's a sense of obligation to others, a fear of failure, or maybe even just a lack of that initial spark, that internal drive.
Yeah, it's a natural human response, isn't it? To avoid the unknown, stick with what's predictable, even if it might not be completely fulfilling in the long run.
Absolutely. And the chapter really emphasizes that a truly meaningful hero's journey, it has to come from within. It has to be driven by that inner desire, that yearning for something more. And it talks about how mentors can play a vital role in this process. Think about those key people in your own life who've really encouraged you to believe in yourself.
Yeah, those figures who pushed you to strive for something bigger, something beyond what you thought was possible. And the book gives examples of those mentors. It could be parents, coaches, teachers, maybe even religious figures, right? Those people who planted out seed of self-belief.
And it's interesting because the chapter does kind of point out that a lot of men do end up shrinking back from that call to action. They settle into that comfort zone, and it can lead to Well, to lives that are maybe full of unfulfilled potential, those what ifs that linger in the back of your mind.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought, but it's also, I think, a powerful reminder for those who are listening now to really pay attention to that call, when it comes.
And one thing I really appreciate is that the chapter doesn't just leave you there, right? It also offers this really strong message of hope. It says, at any age, you can do something truly remarkable. And it uses the example of Nelson Mandela, who was released from prison at 71 and became the president of South Africa at 75.
Talk about a late bloomer.
Yeah, exactly. That's an incredible example that shows you can really answer that call at any stage of life. It's never too late. And I love how the chapter even includes that quote from George Eliot, that it's never too late to be what you might have been. It just reinforces that idea.
Absolutely. And then you have the example of John Glenn, who joined the NASA space program, not in his 20s, but at 37. And then he went on to have this incredible career in the U.S. Senate. Again, another great example showing that these significant journeys, these life-defining quests, they can happen at any point.
So once you've answered that call and you've really made that conscious decision to leave behind that familiar world, that's when you reach what Dr. Brandeis calls the point of no return. This is where you really start to deepen your commitment to that journey, to that path you've chosen.
Yeah, it's the moment where turning back becomes, less and less likely, maybe even psychologically impossible. You've burned the boats, so to speak.
Exactly. And I think the chapter uses Harry Houdini as a really interesting example here. It talks about how he had this unwavering ambition, even as a kid, to become a magician. So he leaves home at a young age and faces all this hardship, but because he is so deeply committed to his dream, he eventually achieves this legendary level of success, right?
It shows the power of that early drive, that absolute dedication to what you want to achieve. And, we see a more modern example of this with Elon Musk, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, his decision to pour so much of himself and his resources into SpaceX, Tesla, and Solar City, even after selling PayPal, he was even facing the very real possibility of financial ruin. But his dedication to those ventures was just profound. He went all in.
And the book really emphasizes how critical that commitment was to his success, that willingness to risk everything for what you believe in.
And as that journey unfolds, forging a new identity becomes absolutely essential. At this point, the hero is distinctly separate from their former life, their old self. And this isn't just about external changes, is it? It's so much more internal, so much deeper.
It really is. This is where the hero starts to go through this profound process of self-discovery, creating a new sense of self.
It's like shedding an old skin that no longer fits. It's about asking those big questions. Who am I becoming as I face these new experiences? And how can I let go of the limitations of my past?
And the chapter makes a really important point here, which is that even though the hero shows this willingness to change, to grow, they're going to face challenges along the way.
Oh, absolutely. It's guaranteed, right? Growth rarely comes without struggle. There will be difficulties that test resolve, their abilities, their commitment to the path.
And the thing is, without that familiar safety net of their old life, they have to learn to rely on themselves.
Exactly. The hero is forced to tap into those inner resources, to find strength and resilience from within. And that's where those early challenges, the ones they overcome, they become so crucial.
Yeah, those small victories early on, they really build the confidence you need to face the bigger battles down the road. I love how the chapter brings in the story of Walt Disney's early setbacks. Being fired for a supposed lack of imagination, can you imagine? And then having his first animation studio go bankrupt. That's rough. There was no indication at that point that he would achieve the monumental success that he did.
Right. It just shows you that those initial failures, they can be stepping stones to something truly great, as long as you're willing to learn from them and keep going.
So move on. The journey then intensifies with what Dr. Brandeis calls a multitude of trials. And this is where things get really interesting because it's not just one big test. It's a series of challenges that are essential for the hero's transformation.
Yeah, this is where the rubber really meets the road, so to speak. And the book really emphasizes how these trials can often seem insurmountable. It's like the odds are stacked against you and you're being pushed to your absolute limit.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of the point? Aren't these trials designed to push you beyond what you think you're capable of?
Exactly. It's about stretching those boundaries, discovering what you're truly made of.
Now, this is where the chapter reminds us about the role of mentors, or having a support system during these tough times.
Yeah, it's so crucial to have those guides, those people who offer wisdom, assistance, even just a listening ear.
Absolutely. You don't have to go through this alone. And Dr. Brandeis uses the Greek epic, the Odyssey, as this really great example of how to visualize these different trials. He points out all the challenges Odysseus faces, the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, the sorcery of Circe. It's all incredibly metaphorical.
What's amazing is how timeless and universal those metaphors are, right? I mean, they still resonate with us today. And the book explicitly states that these seemingly fantastical dangers the Odysseus faces, they're really metaphors for the different kinds of challenges we face in our own lives. It's about dealing with addiction, navigating relationships with difficult people, those temptations that can lead us astray.
And I think that's such a crucial point. The chapter talks about those temptations, both material and physical, that can cause people to abandon their path, to lose sight of their goals. He even uses the example of Robin Givens' impact on Mike Tyson and, the destructive influences that sex and drugs had on those rock and roll icons, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain. It's really a cautionary tale about how easily those external forces can derail even the most promising journey.
Right. And it makes you think about the forces in your own life, those things that might be pulling you off course. But it's not always these big dramatic things, is it? Sometimes the obstacles are more subtle. And the chapter makes this really interesting point about saboteurs. And these aren't necessarily villains, lurking in the shadows. They can actually be well-meaning friends and family.
Which seems kind of counterintuitive, right? But it makes sense.
It does. And the book explains how people who are on this hero's journey, they often get labeled as selfish, unrealistic, even crazy by the people around them, simply because they're choosing a different path.
It's like they're challenging the status quo, and that can make people uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it could be that those people are projecting their own fears or limitations onto you, right?
So being able to discern those genuine supporters from the ones who even unintentionally create obstacles becomes really important. It's about trusting your own inner compass, your own vision.
And the book offers this thought-provoking idea, that because going on this full hero's journey, this path to really achieving your full potential, it's relatively uncommon. Maybe a lot of people unconsciously try to hinder that progress.
It's not necessarily a malicious thing. It's more like they just don't understand it, and maybe they even fear it a little bit.
Right, and their resistance, even if it's unintentional, can still be a big obstacle to overcome.
All right, so the journey then reaches its peak, that pivotal moment that Dr. Brandeis calls the live or die moment. And he uses the vivid image of entering the dragon's lair, that classic image of facing your ultimate fear. And he brings in the example of those brave soldiers landing at Normandy during World War II. I mean, talk about a live or die moment. The stakes couldn't be higher.
Yeah, and he talks about how this moment is often characterized by despair, a sense of like everything is lost. It's the absolute low point, the point where you're forced to confront your greatest fears and what seem like impossible odds.
And this is the amazing part, it's at this very moment when all seems lost, that the hero often discovers this hidden reserve of inner strength. It's like they tap into this source of energy or creativity that they didn't even know they had.
Yeah, they're pushed to their absolute limit, and they have to dig deep, right? They have to access this inner power that was always there but maybe dormant.
And the book gives the incredible example of Audie Murphy, the World War II hero, right? I mean, his actions during that one battle where he single-handedly holds off an entire German counterattack, even though he was wounded and out of ammunition, that's just, it's legendary stuff.
It really is. He climbed onto a burning tank and called in artillery strikes, despite being completely exposed and in immense pain. It's a perfect example of that ultimate test of resilience and the incredible power that we can find within ourselves when we're pushed to the brink.
And then finally, after all those struggles, after facing that ultimate challenge, comes transformation. This is where the hero finally triumphs, achieves their objective. And while there might be external rewards that come with that, wealth, power, fame, Dr. Brandeis points out that those become secondary to the real transformation that has happened within the hero.
It's that internal shift, that growth and change that they've gone through, that's the true reward.
And one of the examples that really resonated with me was Edward Hightow, the champion surfer, who dedicated his life to being a lifeguard on Oahu. He saved over 500 lives, and his story really exemplifies that shift in priorities. It's like after facing those life or death situations, the external rewards just don't seem as important.
Yeah, your values change, your perspective shifts. It's no longer about those superficial things. It's about something much deeper, more meaningful.
And then comes what Dr. Brandeis calls the long road home. So the hero has achieved their goal, faced their fears, they've been transformed, But the journey isn't quite over. Now they have to take those lessons they've learned and integrate them back into their ordinary world.
And that's not always easy, is it? I mean, the chapter points out how old patterns can resurface, those unresolved issues from the past. It's like you're carrying that baggage with you, and it can still trip you up if you're not careful.
Right, it's like you've gone through this incredible transformation, but you still have to do the work of integrating it into your everyday life. And the book points out that often new obstacles pop up during this phase. It's almost like life is throwing those final tests your way just to make sure you're really ready.
It's about using that strength you developed during the main quest, those lessons you've learned, to navigate those last hurdles. And the chapter gives a great example here with the story of Lewis and Clark's return journey after reaching the Pacific Ocean. I mean, they achieved this monumental goal, but the journey back was incredibly arduous. They had to retrieve stolen horses, cross treacherous mountains, deal with attacks from Native American tribes, all sorts of things.
Yeah, it just shows you that even after you reach that peak, that sense of achievement, the journey back to normalcy can be full of challenges. It's not always a smooth ride.
And, the chapter doesn't shy away from the fact that this re-immigration isn't always successful. It talks about the tragic suicide of Meriwether Lewis a few years after the expedition, contrasting it with William Clark's successful career. It's a reminder that the impact of those journeys, those trials, can be long-lasting and complex.
It really makes you think about the long-term effect, the ripples that those experiences create. And then there's this kind of ironic point that Dr. Brandeis makes, which is that when the hero returns, they often find they don't quite fit into that old world anymore.
Yeah, they've changed so much. Their perspective is broader, their capabilities are greater. It's almost like they've outgrown that old life.
Exactly. And the chapter highlights how this reintegration can be especially tough for veterans returning from war.
Yeah, it's a really poignant example. The hero has been off on this transformative journey, while the world back home has continued on its own path. And bridging that gap can be really challenging.
Absolutely. So the chapter wraps up by reiterating this belief that every individual has a purpose, and that we all have our own hero's journey waiting for us. It's a really empowering message.
It is, and he also expresses this concern that so many people never reach their full potential. They get stuck in that comfort zone, they fear change, or they just don't have the persistence to overcome obstacles.
And Dr. Brandeis is very clear that ultimately success in this journey, it comes down to determination. It's that inner drive to keep pursuing what you know is right, to keep going even when things get tough.
And this is where he introduces the book itself as a resource. It's a guide for men who are looking to live better, healthier lives. And it's packed with advice from all these different experts in their fields.
Yeah, it's a great resource. And I think that the website that goes along with the book is really valuable too. It just reinforces that this is a comprehensive approach to men's health and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. The chapter really stresses that there are so many great tools and interventions out there, things that can really help men thrive. But the most important thing is that personal commitment, that willingness to put in the work.
And Dr. Brandeis concludes the chapter by wishing the listener well on their own unique journey and expressing this hope that they will, in turn, go on to inspire and mentor future generations of heroes. It's a nice touch, right?
It is. And then he brings in this fantastic example, this real-world illustration of the entire hero's journey through the lens of immigration, which I thought was brilliant.
It really helps to ground those abstract concepts, make them more relatable. And the story he tells is about this man named Rajesh, who was born in a small farming town in India. He faces a lot of hardship early on. His family doesn't really value education, but he has this burning desire to learn.
Yeah, and he faces so many obstacles. I mean, his family actually cuts off financial support, and he ends up traveling to America with just $8 in his pocket. Talk about courage.
It's incredible. And when he arrives in America, he experiences this intense culture shock, But he keeps going. He keeps pushing through. He works as a dishwasher while he's studying. He deals with all sorts of difficulties. But he eventually builds a very successful career as a structural engineer.
It's a classic example of that hero's journey in action, right? He faces those trials, he overcomes them, and he ultimately achieves a level of success that he probably never imagined when he was starting out.
And it doesn't stop there, right? I mean, later in his life, he faces some really serious health challenges, misdiagnosis, heart surgery, all sorts of things. But he's resilient, he makes lifestyle changes, and he's able to regain his health.
His entire story, from those humble beginnings to those incredible challenges and triumphs, I mean, it's just a really powerful testament to the human spirit. And it really brings to life those different stages that Dr. Brandeis outlines in the chapter. It's like a living, breathing example of the hero's journey.
So to wrap things up, this deep dive into this first chapter of the 21st Century Man has been, I think, really enlightening. It's a reminder that life is this ongoing process of transformation, and the hero's journey is this timeless framework that can help us understand that process. And, we can't recommend this book enough.
Absolutely. It's full of insights and practical advice, and it really makes you think about your own journey, your own challenges and triumphs. And, we encourage all the listeners to grab a copy of The 21st Century Man and dive into it themselves. It's a great resource for any guy who's looking to live a better, healthier, more fulfilling life.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and be sure to tune in for our next episode where we'll be exploring Chapter 2, Smart Ways to Reduce Your Health Risks.
Yeah, that's going to be a good one. We'll see you then.
See you then.